Amazing once again. I love the opportunity just to get up front every once in a while. It's because I have a big mouth. I got a big mouth, and sometimes I get so full of hot air, it's just nice to, don't laugh at me, to let it all go. This morning's message is rather simple, but I also think it's important, and I feel very safe about it. Because one, if you like the message, you can come back to me and say, "Thank you, Jesse, that was really good." But if you don't like the message, you can go back to Jody and yell at her because she is the one that put this in my head in the first place. So I can't lose here. If it's good, I'll take the credit. If it's bad, go yell at her. How many of you remember your school days? When you go to class and you sit down and the teacher gets up and says, we're going to start with a pop quiz. And the whole class goes, "Oh, no." Well, guess what? We're going to start today with a pop quiz. And you guys can all moan. "Oh, yeah, see, now you got it. You got it. Okay." But the good news is it's not that difficult of a test. Only 3 questions. You only need to get 2 right to pass, okay? So I would expect most everybody here this morning is going to be able to get 2 of these 3 questions right. Are we ready? And these are not trick questions, okay? Question number 1. What's the name of this church? Oh, you guys are quiet. Maybe we're not going to do so hot. What's the name of this church? Anybody? Somebody? Ebenezer, okay. Somebody's got it right. Ebenezer, okay. Question number 2. This isn't that much more difficult. At least I don't think so. What year is it? 2026. Okay, now we're starting to do pretty good. Now let's make this 3rd question a little bit more difficult. Question number 3. Why is this idiot asking such stupid questions? You see, there is a reason I ask those questions. Why did I ask those questions? I'm here to make a point. I want to talk about what makes an effective church. What makes an effective church? And we are going to talk about perhaps the most effective church in all of history. Now, this church began probably around the year 50 A.D. So we're talking old. We're talking long ago, land far away. But here's the thing. The very reason that we are here at the Ebenezer Bible Church in the year of 2026 is because there was a church in Philippi around 50 A.D. Think about this. We're talking a church that was so effective that it is still having an impact all around the world almost 2,000 years later. And then the question is, what makes it such an effective church? What is it about this church in Philippi that made it so effective? And maybe I ought to back up and just kind of explain what I'm talking about as far as a church, or the fact that we are here because this church was there. You see, the church in Philippi, this here was the first church. This is where the gospel went into Europe for the very first time. This is where Paul took the gospel into Macedonia. And we began this church here in Philippi. This was the very first church in Europe. And what happened is this church was obsessed with spreading the gospel. And so it started to spread out from this church all across Europe. And if you remember your American history, we remember about the explorers that had come from Europe. And when they came to here, the quote-unquote New World, they brought the gospel with them. And so the gospel then spread across this nation. So the very fact that we are here is a testimony to the fact that this church in Philippi was so effective. And so the question is, so what makes this church so effective? And we want to focus in really on one verse. But I'm going to read Philippians chapter 1, and I'm just going to read verses 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then we will get into it. Paul says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making requests with joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, and being confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. And this church just blows my mind. One, we're still here because that church was there. And then when we read the book of Philippians, we've got to understand that Paul was sitting in prison, chained to a bunch of guards. He was not in a great spot. And yet when you read the book of Philippians, you cannot help but to see the excitement, to hear the joy. How many of you know that sometimes when you talk to people and you get them on a certain topic, their eyes just kind of light up just a little bit. And they start getting excited and they can become passionate about a certain subject. Do you ever know anyone like that? Man, you can be talking about one thing, but boy, if you get them talking about hunting or fishing or football or baseball or whatever that topic is, all of a sudden they just start to light up. They become alive. Well, Paul's his alive topic was this church. When you started talking about this church in Philippi, he couldn't help but get excited. Man, his face just lit up like a light bulb. What was it about this church that was so exciting? Give you a clue. It wasn't anything that we would, in the modern day, consider a great thing as far as a church. You see, it wasn't the fact that the church had a celebrity pastor up front and wearing skinny jeans, preaching a well-polished service or sermon. It wasn't that at all. The church did not have all of the fancy lighting systems and didn't have any smoke machines. They didn't even have a worship band that was well-polished and talented. And if you actually look at the church just as its own, you'd think, well, that church is nothing special. In fact, if you go by modern criteria for starting a church, this church doesn't have a chance. This church was started by just a couple of ladies. That's all it was, just a couple of ladies. And then there was another lady who had been possessed by a demon, and she joined the church. Some believe that the quote-unquote executive pastor of this church was a female, and that may fly in the face of the theology of some people, but it's Scripture. You can read it for yourself in Acts chapter 16. And so there's nothing special about this church from a human standpoint. But this church literally changed the world. And so what was it? What's the mark of the effective church? Paul tells us in verse number 5, and this is kind of where we get the word Jody, and I don't want to beat a dead horse because Jody's done a phenomenal job of teaching this, but I can't help but I just can't shake this one. Verse 5 says, Paul is so incredibly excited and so grateful, and he's praying for them, and he says, because of their fellowship in the gospel. The fellowship in the gospel. And that's kind of where I want to focus in on this morning. The fellowship in the gospel. Because this is something we don't understand. We just don't grasp it. How many of you ever heard of a church having a quote-unquote fellowship meal after church? Ever hear that? A fellowship meal. There's going to be a fellowship meal following the service on Sunday or whatever. That statement, okay, that kind of makes sense, but it cheapens the word fellowship. Because whenever we have a fellowship meal, we're usually pretty heavy on the food and very light on the fellowship. At best, it's a lot of socializing with some food, but there's no fellowship. We don't fully grasp this word fellowship. The word fellowship here is the Greek word koinonia, or sometimes you will hear it pronounced koinonia. Strong says that it's a partnership, or it is a participation. I give you my definition that I think sums it up about as well, at least as I can sum it up, and that is, fellowship is when we come together for a cause greater than oneself. Fellowship is not socializing. Socializing can be part of fellowship, but a fellowship is much, much, much more than a socializing party. Fellowship is where we come together as one body, as one unit, and that is for one cause that is greater than oneself. A great example of fellowship would be the community day that we have here at the church. See, that's a day when we all kind of come together. Everybody has their positions. Everybody has their spot, their role that they play. And we all kind of come together. We work together as a church for a cause that is much, much bigger than the church. Does that make sense? So a fellowship is when we come together as one body for a cause that is much, much bigger than us. And so Paul is saying what makes the effective church is the fellowship. The coming together for a cause. But then that leaves us another question. What is the cause? Well, we go back to that verse, and it says, it is the fellowship in the gospel. So The fellowship is coming together for this one cause. The gospel is that cause. That just brings us to a problem. We typically don't understand the gospel. And that's kind of where Jody kind of got me thinking along these lines. Is a number of weeks ago, she stood up here and she asked a question. What is the gospel? And it's interesting, nobody seems to be able to answer that question definitively. And that means like, wait a minute, that's a simple question. And we come to church all the time and all we hear is, we got to share the gospel, we got to share the gospel, we got to share the gospel. And when she asked, well, what's the gospel? Our response was, I don't know. And so I went and I asked this question in front of several other churches. I asked that same question, so what is the gospel? And you know the response I got? I don't know. Some say, well, we're gonna get into it anyhow. What is the gospel? This is where we're gonna just dig into this. Okay, so the gospel comes from the Old English Godspell, which means the good story or the good news. And so when Jody asked, what is the gospel? Almost everybody said, well, it's the good news. Well, yeah, that's technically what it is, but what is that? What is the good news? The Greek word that's translated as gospel is the Greek, the euangelion, which is a Greek word. There is the EU, the prefix meaning good. And that's where you'll hear in Catholic churches especially, the Eucharist, which means a good thanksgiving or good grace. EU meaning good, and then there is the root word there, angelos, which it means messenger. That angelos, that's where we get our English word angel from. So it's almost a good angel or a good messenger. And she explained it very well in ancient times when a king sent his army out to battle. When the battle was over, if the army was successful and they won the battle, they would send a messenger back home to share the quote-unquote good news that the war had already been won. And so the gospel means the good news. It is basically telling the good news that the battle has been won. That is what it is, the good news. But again, what does that mean? If you go out and tell the world that the battle's already been won, the world's thinking, this guy's off his rocker. They're going to want to put you in a mental hospital. And if it's me saying it, they've got good reasons to throw me in a mental hospital. Sometimes that's just where I belong. The good news. But here's the thing. We have to understand what it is that is good news. And Paul doesn't want us to be ignorant as far as what the gospel is. And so he is very clear as to what the gospel is. When he was writing to the church there in Corinth, he explained to them in very clear, concise terms what the gospel is. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, Paul says, I want to remind you of what? The gospel. So Paul's like, this is it. This is the most important thing. It is the gospel. And this is what I've preached to you. And verse number 2 says, and it is this good news. It is the gospel that saves you. And if you hold, and this is if you hold firmly to the word. But if you forget the gospel, everything else that we do is in vain. Or in other words, everything else we do is empty and meaningless. You wonder why so many churches are ineffective? We've lost sight of the gospel. And as a result, our faith is empty. It's lacking. It's meaningless. And then verse number 3, Paul says, so I am going to, again, remind you, and I'm going to pass this on to you again. And so now he's going in and very clearly stating exactly what the gospel is. And he says this, it's that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. And verse number 4 says, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Basic terms, the gospel is the birth, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's pretty simple. But still, what makes that such great news? I was talking to a guy a while ago, and I'm going to try to detail the conversations to the best of my memory. But I asked the guy, so what is the gospel? And his response was, well, it's the good news. I said, that's right. So why don't you tell me what the good news is? And he's like, well, it's obviously the Bible. I said, well, you're kind of right. The Bible contains the good news, but why don't you tell me what the good news is? He said, well, I don't know. And I asked him this question. I said, have you ever been at work and you think, oh shucks, this problem is bigger than I am? Or you start questioning, am I really good enough for this? Am I tough enough to get through this situation? Have you ever asked yourself that question? He said, well, sure. He said, I think most everybody says that from time to time. I said, you just hit the point right there. I said, did you ever stop to wonder why virtually every human being on the planet wrestles with this idea of, am I good enough? Am I tough enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I smart enough? This whole concept of not enough just seems to come up over and over. And it's like, do you ever think about, why is that everybody asks that same question? He said, I don't know. He said, do you ever stop to think that maybe we ask that question because inherently every single one of us knows we're not good enough? I said, the reality is, you and I both know, we can work our tails off and still end up coming up short. We can promise ourselves we are always going to do the right thing, and inevitably, we're going to end up doing the wrong thing sometimes. Why is that? Because we're not good enough. The reason we all feel that is because we are born with this instinct that tells us no matter how good we try to be, we're never quite good enough. There is a gap between our best efforts and God's perfect standards. And no matter how good we are, we instinctively know we're never good enough. And I said, but here's the good news. You don't have to be good enough. We don't have to be good enough. Why? Because Jesus was already good enough for us. I said, if you could have been good enough, Jesus would not have had to come to this earth and die on a cross. He wouldn't have had to do any of that. But he did that because he knew you weren't good enough. And the good news for you, you don't have to be good enough. Because Jesus already is good enough for you. And I will never forget this. In that moment, there was a single tear started forming at his eyes, just started to come down. And he said, now the gospel makes sense. And he turned around and he was gone. Obviously, that conversation kind of struck a nerve. But he was able to grasp the basic concept of the gospel. And you see, the effective church is a church that comes together with one cause, one purpose. And that is to share the good news of what Jesus Christ has already done for them. For those of you who have read my book, you will have already known this story, but billions of years ago in ancient history, when I was younger, I was at a state playoff game. Our girls' basketball team was really good that year, and we were at a playoff game, and the game got off to a very slow, sluggish start, and it wasn't pretty, and our key player went down with an injury, and it just wasn't good. But as the game progressed, the team started to pull together and gained its footing, and eventually, by the time we got to the middle of the fourth quarter there, it was pretty evident that we overpowered the opponent. And I still remember this clear as day. This will never leave my mind. Is we were there in the gym, and I remember the other team getting a basket. I don't know if they hit a big three or whatever it was, and their fans got so excited and they cheered and as all excited. And we, the students section, had this crazy moment of clarity. And we just kind of laughed at them. It's like, so they scored a basket. Who cares? We won the game. And so in that moment, we kind of turned and pointed to the scoreboard. And so we started to chant to the other fans, look at the scoreboard. Because what we knew, they could score some points. That's okay. We're okay with that. It's not going to bother us much, because the good news is the game has already been won. The other team can score some points, but the game has already been won. See, we can get so upset and so worked up when we look at the news and we see that we've got fighting going on in Iran, and we can read about all these horrible things that are going on in the world, and it can take us down, it can wear on us. But an effective church is going to realize the enemy's going to win some battles. But the good news is Jesus already won the war. The key for us is to look at the scoreboard, because Jesus already won the battle for us. Let's pray.